All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second Saturday education series. So my name is Kristen. I'm the project director for Huio Koalapoca, and we have been running these educational series since last fall as a way to try to connect with people in outreach settings when we're not able to go out and have in-person outreach events during the pandemic, but they've really proved to be a cool opportunity for us to learn from other organizations about the work that's happening in Koalapoca, and also for a chance for our staff and partners in projects to share about their interests and the work that they're doing as well. So if you're not quite familiar with our organization, just a brief intro to Huio Koalapoca. We are a nonprofit based in Kailua on Oahu, but we work in the entire Koalapoca region from Makapu'u to Kualoa. And our main focus is doing ecosystem restoration work, impacting water runoff into streams and how that stream water affects our ocean health. So our mission is protecting ocean health by restoring the Aina mauka to makai. So all of our projects focus usually around water sources, whether that is inputs from residential and commercial areas, inputs into stream systems, and trying to revitalize the stream system so that the water is ultimately healthier for all the ecosystems along that stream and the nearshore ecosystems that we all love to play and be in here in Hawaii. So we today will be featuring a presentation by one of our current KUPU members, Maya. Maya is originally from Kaua'i, and she is currently attending Manoa to get her BS in Environmental Sciences. And she is becoming quite the bird lover, especially with all the birds that we get to interact with at our restoration project at Heia. So Maya has chosen to talk today about wetland birds of Pokomoku, and I will turn it over to Maya to begin her presentation.
Hi guys, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so today I'm going to have a presentation on the native wetland birds of Koalapoca. And the reason why I chose this presentation was primarily because I've grown a passion over my internship with Huio Koalapoca for the native wetland bird population. And I want to further my career into studying more about them. So a little bit about the Koalapoca is that it's located on the windward side of Oahu, and it stretches from Makapu'u all the way to Kualoa. It covers roughly over 43,000 acres, and this region is made up of 11 different ahupua'a. And ahupua'a basically means land division within the moku itself. So there are over 10 main stream channels that reach the ocean throughout the Koalapoca region, and 2 canals called Kainui and Kaelepulu Canal. And Kaelepulu Canal is roughly about in this area, and Kainui Canal is about in this area. Much of the area that has been impacted by urbanization is at lowland elevations, so about from 0 to 1,000 meters, or even coastal elevations, which is about 30 meters or less. Quinoa Marsh is located just above the canal, so maybe about, can everybody see my pointer finger? So Quinoa Marsh is located just above the canal, and it's around 830 acres in total, making it the largest wetland in the state of Hawaii. Important role in flood control and sediment filtration, and it also protects the urbanized areas of Kailua and Kailua Bay's ecosystem through groundwater recharge and improved water quality. The flood control is a key factor in this region because of its high annual precipitation. So the Koalapoca mountain range is kind of what's left of the Koala Shield volcano. And the Koala Shield volcano was one of 2 volcanoes that had formed Oahu in the first place, roughly about 3 to 4 million years ago. Over the years of natural weathering and geologic changes, paired with a lot of ample precipitation, the round shape has subsided into valleys and crevices and ridges that you see today on the Koalapoca mountain range. So the northeast trades and a steep mountain slope can cause something called orographic lifting, which is essentially an air mass that meets a geographical feature such as a mountain, and the air will have no other option but to rise over it. And since this rising air is likely packed with a lot of moisture, cloud formation starts to occur, and this event can trigger higher chances of precipitation within the Koalapoca region. Average annual precipitation in the Koala mountain range, rain can roughly reach about 80 inches per year. However, at sea level, it's around 38 inches per year, which is still really significant for sea level. The wetland and estuary habitats of Koalapoca rely heavily on these rains and freshwater input that the mountain range can feed, as do the flora and fauna, which are the plants and animals that grow within it. So the key takeaway is that orographic precipitation is a leading factor that influences rainfall and freshwater input within this region. So a little bit about the brief history about the Koalapoca wetland environment is first off, there is some geologic evidence that supports the idea that Kauai was a shallow bay at some point, maybe around 1500 BC. And it essentially, formed a barrier reef, which grew between the bay and the Pacific Ocean. And that is kind of what you could call now Kailua. So by about 500 BC, the sea level had lowered to what its present level is today. And this kind of exposed the reef, and by reef exposure, that meant that the ocean was now blocked off from the inner bay. And because the ocean was blocked off from the inner bay, the water essentially started to become more brackish. And as Polynesians arrived around the same time Kauai Lagoon was connected to Ka'elupulu Lagoon, there was naturally flowing channels as they arrived there. So the surrounding area of Kauai was densely forested back then, and then it was cleared for about a century due to agricultural purposes primarily. There was also a 400-acre fish pond that was developed around 1750. So it kind of had like fish like mullet, ava, o'oku. It also had lo'ikalo growing in the irrigation channels along the fish pond. It wasn't until settlers from other countries or from other continents that had arrived to Hawaii that much of the native Hawaiians' natural resources were quickly depleted. Plantations were built once arriving settlers realized that the profit was there, and nothing was in their way to stop them, basically. Resources like freshwater springs and stream flow have been diverted to fulfill the needs of sugar and rice plantations within the Koalapoca region. So the third and fourth photo were actually from Waimanalo Sugar Company, and it kind of depicts how vast the area is that they had their sugar plantation. So continuing into the 1900s, much of Kauai was still being used for rice cultivation. The water from Kauai was then drained in 1920, as Waimanalo Sugar Company just kind of needed more and more water. So the fifth photo that you see here is actually of Waikulua Local Pond. And the black and white photo next to that is an aerial view portion of the He'ia Ahupua'a that was thriving in about the 1920s with over 300 acres of wetlands feeding their lo'ikalo. So some areas were, heavily depleted by plantations, but then again, areas like He'ia still were harboring kalo fields. So today, after the plantations have closed their doors, areas like Kauai are now designated as a Ramsar Wetland Reserve, meaning that it's an area designated for its importance. And a lot of these reserves are growing throughout our nation. If anybody has any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to let me know. So here's like a little geographic layout that dates back to the early 1900s, and it basically depicts what the layout looked like throughout the plantation eras. So there wasn't much space given for public land purposes, and most of it was occupied by plantation owners at the time. The wetlands were primarily growing rice and taro as commercial products. When plantations don't have sufficient runoff, they create heavy sediment buildup over time. And when huge flooding events occurred, that buildup would be carried further downstream, clogging inlets and making conditions uninhabitable for our wetland birds. So in this photo, you can kind of see most of the area that's in the blue dashed line is our wetland reserves. Here down in the red would be the Waimanalo Sugar Company. And then kind of in the green is where you see the public land dispersal. So for Waimanalo, an example, the public lands are very minimal. About 2/3 of Waimanalo's region is already occupied by Waimanalo Sugar Company. So that's a really good example. All right, so on to threats to Hawaii's native avian populations. The habitat loss over the last 110 years is approximately 31% in the coastal plain wetlands. A shift in wetland agriculture to commercial crops also has reduced the amount of wetland habitat. So kind of like what we were talking about of the plantations, they definitely had a major part in the effects of them. Also, introduced predators, feral cats, mongoose, rats, even dogs off of leashes can always be a harm to eggs and hatchlings of wetland birds. And it's really important that we continue to monitor that trend, especially when it comes to the mongoose population. Altered hydrology is basically when modifications for flood control is now limiting the water resources for the wetland birds. And a lot of altered hydrology did happen during the plantation era as well. A lot of the non-native invasive plants do thrive in Hawaii, unfortunately. Several species of invasive plants, including water lettuce, water hyacinth, mangrove, they reduce open water and mud flats and shallows, basically clogging the streams, not letting the water basically breathe. And then also we got avian diseases that do affect most of our Hawaiian water birds. And it is known as botulism. And botulism is basically like binding to nerve endings and interferes with muscle movement. And it's basically caused by a toxin that is a type of soil bacterium. And it is mostly known to occur in Koloa ducks. Lastly, the environmental contaminants are primarily about fuel and oil spills, and they are the most common contaminant threat to the native Hawaiian bird population. Okay, so we're gonna dive into a few examples of our native wetland birds of Koala Pokomoku. First off, I wanna start with the Hawaiian moorhen, also known as the alai ula. So the alai ula has a really wide variety of diets. It likes to eat mollusks, insects, water plants, algae. Its behavior is very timid. They stay close to vegetation and they will hide quickly if they sense danger. And sometimes especially during nesting season, you can kind of see alai ula being super more on the aggressive side, more territorial. You know, they really don't want anybody near their nest. So they do have a lot of warning calls. And their habitat is primarily freshwater marshes, wetland agricultural areas such as the taro patches, streams, irrigation ditches, wet pastures, brackish water habitats, basically anything you could see below 400 feet in elevation. The lifespan, there's not much on the lifespan information or its survivorship. However, a banded moorhen that was captured was dated to be about 10 years old. So they actually do have a really good long lifespan. So the species and life history and breeding biology could definitely be updated in the future. And also the mythology behind the alai ula is that it's known to be the most secretive native water bird. And in Hawaiian legend, these birds were thought to have brought fire from the gods to the Hawaiian people. And its conservation status is really important. It's actually at risk. There's about 300 individuals that have been banded. So it's really important that we keep focusing on a rise in that population. Oops, sorry about that, guys. So here I have a quick voice call for the alai ula in case you guys are ever walking around and you guys see any in the Koalapoca region. You guys actually can have a nice little sound for you to listen to. All right. Let me know if you guys can't hear it. Can you guys hear it? Yeah, okay. So it's super high pitch, not really what you would expect, but it is very, it's a very good characteristic to kind of point out when we know our ala'iula are around us. All right, and so those 300 individuals are currently located mostly on Kaua'i and Oahu. There are a few survey records in the past that have been hit on other portions of the 5 major islands. But as far as right now, most of the population does occur on Kaua'i, and it is doing very well. I have a little bit of the facts about their nesting habits. So they do nest in reeds and other aquatic vegetation, such as dry grasses. In some cases, it could be, you know, the invasive umbrella sedge, which is something that we come across a lot on our property over at Heia Estuary. They do like to nest in areas with standing freshwater and dense vegetation. And so pretty much anything less than 24 inches deep is kind of like what their habitat would look like. Nesting occurs year round. Its most activity would occur between March and August. The platform nests are constructed in dense vegetation over water. So you could tell that their main goal is to make sure that their nests are not in that water. And it's a very good tactic when it comes to, you know, predators such as mongoose that don't like water at all. So it's really important that they do that. The type of plants used for nest construction isn't really as important as the stem density and height. And a total of about 5 to 6 eggs can be laid and hatch about after 22 days. And although the chicks can swim shortly after hatching, they're pretty independent on their parents for about several weeks. And here I have a, oh, sorry.
Let's watch these videos really quick, and then let's pause for some questions. I know I want to I'd love to look at those maps and all that info a little bit longer too.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. All right, so I have a couple videos here just for you guys to see the native moorhen in its foraging habitat and how it kind of, you know, communicates. So here's the first one. Can you guys hear the sound okay on my video? Okay, so on to the second one. This is just another quick video. We'll just go over that quickly. So here's the native moorhen running across the vegetation. I really thought this was a cute video.
I really like both of those videos.
Yeah.
Of course, we've got babies in the first one, and then it looked like a mat of aquatic vegetation on the other one. So it really shows that these birds aren't known from other islands because they're really not great flyers. They'd rather kind of get their momentum and start running across that vegetation.
Right. And that actually brings up a good point that they are sedentary. So once they stick to a region, they really don't leave it. All right. So yeah, let me just pause really quick for any questions. I did go over a super interactive map. If you guys want me to go back to that, just let me know.
Yeah, will you click back to that map?
All right.
Oh no, sorry, will you click back to the ala'iula
Sure, yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah. That one has some really cool information about nesting as well. So we, at our HOK restoration project at Heia, we have at least one one breeding pair, I should say, and last summer, around July, they fledged 3 chicks. So we're hoping that that pair will have another nest this year, and we believe their young have kind of spread out over the project area and maybe onto other properties that are also doing restoration. So we're hoping to see some birds there. That would be really exciting. But these birds aren't known for flying long distances, so that could really be a big reason why their populations aren't more spread out through the entire state. Does anybody have questions for Maya about the Alai'ula?
I have a question. Can you guys hear me okay? Awesome. Maya, I was curious, is it around 300 Alai'ula that are banded or 300 just present statewide?
So I believe that that's about 300 that have been banded. And that's a really good point to bring up, Lane, because there definitely could be some birds out there that we haven't banded yet.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Another good spot to see Alai'ula in Kailua and to see a lot of the birds that Maya is going to be talking about today is along the Kaua'i levee that runs on the makai side of the levee. You can see Alai'ula and Alaikeokeo and sometimes the stilts there, but also at the Hamakua wetland area in Kailua as well is another great spot to see these. Okay.
All right. All right, so on to our second native wetland bird of the day. We have the Io, also known as the Hawaiian Stilt. They're opportunistic feeders. They prey on a variety of animals and they really don't have much of a particular diet. So they get anything within the mudflats, the small crabs, insects, polychaete worms, small fish, and their long beak really helps with getting into the mudflats. So, and their behavior is they do aggressively defend their nests, and they have a really good reason for doing that, and we will go over that in just a bit. They're calling and diving at intruders. They also perform broken wing displays that take potential predators away, excuse me. And their habitat is primarily fresh brackish saltwater. Foraging habitats are successional marshlands with shallow water and also low growing vegetation and exposed tidal flats. So our Heia estuary is a very good example of where you would see Io or Hawaiian Stilt foraging in the mudflats. Their abundance in total, just for Oahu's population, they're stable, slightly increasing, but the count numbers are variable still. So from 1993 to 2003, there was approximately 1,300 individuals. And then by 2001, about 2,600 were recorded. So their population's doing fairly well. So, and at that point, the conservation status is still at risk, but the population is rising. And here I have a quick little sound for you guys to listen to in case you come across some Io. So you can tell that they are super chatty birds, and you can pretty much hear them all day, or especially when they're flying, they love to chat in the air. So I hope you guys can hear the sound okay on those calls. All right, a little bit more about the Io range and some nesting facts in Hawaii. They are a little bit more dispersed on the 5 major islands. So you can see them throughout Big Island and also on Molokai, which is a really good sign. The individual moves between about 2 habitats daily. So their breeding habitat differs from their foraging habitat. And nesting occurs on freshly exposed mudflats, as you can see in this photo. And the nesting occurs mostly in low-growing vegetation, and also will nest in islands of fresh or brackish ponds, of artificial floating nest structures. And nesting normally occurs between March and August and can peak between May and June. And each individual bird generally produces about 3 to 4 eggs. and the fledglings will remain with their parents for several months, as opposed to a Lai'ula where it was several weeks. IO stay with their parents for several months. And there also is known to be inter-island movements by the IO. And so when we were talking about the Lai'ula being sedentary and not really flying as much into the air, the IO does move throughout the region of Oahu. Any questions?
Yeah, I think the IO are so interesting because they really do move quite a bit day to day, like just throughout their daily patterns and their habits. So me personally, where my grandparents live in Kailua, you could pretty much tell the time of day by which direction by when the IO came through. You could hear them flying up the waterway around 6 o'clock in the morning, and they would fly probably from Nu'upia Ponds on the marine base, heading up towards Kaua'i Marsh to forage for the day. And then in the evening around like 5:30ish, they'd come flying back down the waterway from Kaua'i back towards Nu'upia Ponds. So it was really cool to, you know, kind of hear them every day, and they were familiar neighbors in that sense. And also speaking with an older uncle, he said, oh yeah, I used to know when it was time to go home because the IO would come flying by, and then it was time for me to go home for dinner. So just to have that, you know, consistency and pattern in the IO is so neat. And I think we've seen that and noticed that a lot with the IO that are at the Hei'a Restoration Project. They've been known to nest in the taro patches on the raised mounds and the taro patches upland at Koko'iwi. And they come down and they land essentially in the same spot every day on our restoration project to forage. They have this one little pond that they like to land at, and they kind of buzz us as they fly in. And yesterday we were lucky enough at Kaua'i in the restoration ponds to see a young bird. It's much bigger than the one pictured here, but we got maybe 60 yards away and the parents just went into, they were flying around, would not be quiet. And we maybe stood there for less than 5 minutes, kind of admiring from a distance, but the parents did not stop flying us. So we backed off, but they are very territorial. And it was really cool to see that behavior yesterday too.
Yeah, just in time for this presentation, we got a full-on example right there. It was awesome.
Anybody else have questions or maybe personal interactions with the birds?
I would definitely agree with the territorialness. Just yesterday, I witnessed, I'm Michael, I work up at James Campbell, and yeah, I get to see these birds every day. And yeah, the stilts will literally swoop in from across the pond. Like Nalani was saying, they do travel to forage and stuff throughout the day. And if you come up on a nest, you'll hear them coming from a ways away. And then all of a sudden they'll be in front of your truck beeping. They act like they're a 12-foot tall bird. And, you know, yeah, it's just pretty amazing. And a beautiful sound, but after, you know, they don't stop. That sound is imprinted in your brain. So they do a pretty good job of, if not pecking at you to get out of there, they'll annoy you to get out of there. So
yeah, I think that's a really good point, Michael. In that, you know, they're so territorial. It's like, you know, what could be the reason? And by looking at this picture, we exactly know why. They barely put much work, as I could say in the nicest term, into the nest itself. So if you're ever coming across any mudflats, these nests are basically camouflage. And, you know, because that they're on exposed mudflats, I do agree, you know, maybe the Hawaiian stilt is like, yeah, I need you to like step away from my nest. All right, I'm gonna move along unless anybody else has any more questions. So we have a couple of IO videos for you guys to look at. So here's it basically foraging, you know, picking its beak throughout it so it can kind of stick it all the way down and just pull out those arthropods. Yeah, and so I love this photo of it because you can really see the difference between the body size and the leg size. Really cool. Almost like a mini flamingo. And also another one, this is actually the IO mom sitting on its baby. And this is actually at Kaua'i Pond. So I really love that video because, you know, it's kind of like a little half squat, do what I can with my extremely long legs. And also when you look at the chicks, it's like, wow, the chicks even already have that same characteristics of already having long legs. So that's really cool to point out.
That picture is the cutest thing. I never realized that they, you know, protect their babies that way. And that picture threw me for a loop when I first looked at it. I was like, wait a minute, what's going on there with those legs? Oh,
Yeah.
that is too cute.
It's super funny. So kind of all you see is like these two pairs of like legs just kind of sticking out. All right, so on to our third bird of the day. We have our Auku'u, or black-crowned night heron. And his diet primarily focuses on shallow wetland areas, foraging for, you know, a diversity of insects and, you know, a lot of bigger prey such as fish, frogs, mice, even young other native wetland birds. So keep that in mind that Auku'u also can be a predator when it comes to our other native avian populations. Its behavior is known to be kind of a social bird. So you will see it around other bird species, kind of just doing its own thing on the side, but, you know, definitely aware. But those in Hawaii are, you know, frequently seen alone. Night heron in Hawaii are diurnal, unlike continental birds. And that's a very interesting fact. Its habitat occurs in a wide range of aquatic habitats, lowland ponds, estuaries, aquatic aquaculture farms, urban waterways, golf course ponds. You know, they don't really mind people. They're not as timid as a Lai'ula and the IO. They're fine with it. You can see them throughout, you know, the daytime kind of foraging in the golf course ponds. It's pretty funny. And its abundance in general, the population is variable but appears stable. So from 1983 to 2003, we've had counted just over 400 individuals, so banded individuals. This number is certainly underestimated, and we could definitely do a survey update based on the Auku'u population of the Koalapoca region. And lastly, the conservation status is of least concern. So I have a couple of voice calls for you. That was the Lai'ula. All right. So I'm not too sure if they were a little bit too faint for you guys. I do apologize if it's a little quiet. I can also replay them if you would like. But what I want you to kind of get the idea is that it has a little bit of a deep raspy voice, and and what I kind of look at it as is like it kind of reminds me of an egret's voice because they kind of have that brr. So it's really cool to see that. I've actually haven't heard of an Auku'u call in person. So it was very interesting to find that voice memo. A little bit about the Auku'u nesting facts in Hawaii. So out of the last 3 native wetland birds that we had focused on, they did come with a range map that was formulated in about 2003. But as far as the Auku'u, they don't have a range map for the state of Hawaii yet. So that's also something we can focus on in the future. But as far as nesting facts, the male is basically the one who chooses the nest site in a higher elevated tree. Usually it's in a habitat that's safe from predators, such as on an island or in a swamp, or maybe over water, such as hanging mangrove trees. So you kind of see what where I'm getting with that. But yeah, so basically the male will sit there on the nest and be there all day advertising for the female to come by. And the black-crowned night herons nest colonially, often within a dozen nests in a single tree. And colonies can sometimes last up to 50 years. And, you know, this is a North American reference based on a species that is closely related to the black-crowned night heron in Hawaii. So the fact that, you know, there is evidence that colonies can last up to 50 years is a really good note to take down when we are studying more about the night crown population in Hawaii. So the male will start building the nest and make like a platform of like sticks and twigs, other vegetation, and he will collect it from the ground. Once he's pretty much found a mate, the male continues collecting material, passes it on to the female, works onto the nest. Some of the nests are sturdy, others are flimsy. You could kind of see basically the nest is comprised of just sticks and branches. And the clutch size in general is about 3 to 5 eggs. Does anybody have any questions about the Auku'u?
I think you brought up a good point that there's, you know, very closely related species on the continent, and these kind of colonies of many nests can last for quite a long time. I haven't actually ever seen an Auku'u nest. I think that would be cool to see. I often do end up spooking them out of forested areas right next to Quinoa Marsh, and that raspy call gives me a good jump every time, because they'll fly out of a tree and it's like big wings and they're like making their ugly noises. But I've never actually seen a nest. It would be cool to see. That's, you know, that size of a nest is pretty unique in Hawaii. We don't have many birds that size. And I think the counterparts, their cousins on the continent are nocturnal birds, whereas the Auku'u in Hawaii are diurnal, so we'll see them out during the day. I saw an Auku'u recently. I think a range map would be very cool study for these birds. There are quite a few that like to forage along the edge of the Hilton Hawaiian Lagoon. I just saw some like mixing in with the tourists. They're just hanging out, eating the little fish there. And I think historically they haven't really been known to be up more in the valleys and the more mauka regions along the streams, but I think they are starting to be seen in some higher reaches as well. So I know a few different, like Koala Mountain Watershed Partnership, they did see an Auku'u recently. As their helicopter came in for a landing up on the Koala summit, an Auku'u came out of one of the narrow valleys with the stream at the base. So I think anywhere there's a water source with potential food, they might be traveling to. So a range map would be a really cool potential project for somebody.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the range map, you know, and especially that if colonies can be nesting in areas for up to 50 years, that would be a really cool case study. Does anybody else have any more questions? Okay, I'm gonna move on. Okay, and here's an Auku'u video. Ooh, it's a little blurry. Oh, okay, it's good. All right. It's always really cute seeing their pretty little streamers in the wind. Yeah, I really love this video about the Aku'u because you can see when it's hunting and it's looking for its prey, it kind of like focuses right into it, and it sits there like a statue. So it's really cool to watch in person.
And they're smart birds too. I've seen them in areas where, especially down around Kaua'i Nui, where people come to feed the ducks a lot. I have seen these birds grab pieces of bread that humans have thrown out, and they will grab the piece of bread and use it like a fishing lure. They'll grab the bread and drop it closer to the shore and wait for the little fish to come in and eat the little fish, and they will continue to grab and use that piece of bread as their lure. They are darn smart, and it's amazing with those creepy eyes too, and as still as they can be.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, like, you know, it just kind of goes to show like how smart, you know, these birds are and what they do to kind of get their food. All right, so moving on. Oh, sorry guys. All right, we have our Alai Keokeo up next. This is our Hawaiian coot. Its primary diet, basically it only feeds on land primarily. It will dive underwater occasionally and graze on grass adjacent to wetlands. It does like seeds and leaves mostly, but will go for snails, crustaceans, small fish, insects. And its behavior is relatively less aggressive as opposed to a light ula, but it still can be territorial when it comes to nesting season. And its habitat is freshwater and brackish wetlands, including agricultural ponds. So every time I kind of say freshwater, agricultural or brackish wetlands, I want you guys to kind of get the idea that Kauai Marsh is a very key habitat when it comes to, you know, bringing them back to life. And nesting is pretty much like a floating nest, and it's kind of constructed on the ground near the water. A few nests are, you know, found in areas that have like platforms, and sometimes they consist of buoyant stems, such as our native bulrush. Most nesting activity occurs between March and September, and nesting, this is a really key point, is that nesting activity occurs, or I'm sorry, nesting initiation is tied to rainfall. And that also is true for the alai ula, and in that anytime after a significant rainfall event, there has been more of a trend where we do see nests starting to pop up every now and then. So it's a really cool fact to kind of keep in mind. And the appropriate water levels are critical for nest success, just like how the alai ula like it. And their clutch size ranges from a whopping 3 to 10 eggs, which is very surprising. I wasn't expecting 3 to 10 eggs, but it's a really cool thing to know. And lastly, mythology about the alai keokeo is that it's known for their chattiness and their warning cries, and in Native Hawaiians considered alai keokeo to be a deity, but also be considered good to eat. So that was a very interesting fact. Now a little bit about their voice calls I have over here for you guys. So you can kind of hear that it sounds, you know, a lot like the alai ula. And these voice memos are actually all from Macaulay Library. So I definitely double checked before I looked up that this was the Hawaiian coot. I was so surprised listening to these calls because they are so similar to the alai ula. Yep, so little soft chirps, you know, kind of just like their own little warning call. All right, moving on, sorry about that guys, to the alai keokeo range map and nesting facts in Hawaii. So the alai keokeo kind of is dispersed throughout the 5 major islands. The Alaikeokeo and Akula are sedentary, so opposed to the Io and the Auku'u, they only like to stay in one area. They don't fly throughout the island of Oahu very much. Open water nests are usually composed of mats of water. And nesting is primarily year-round, mostly between March and September, and the inner island population averages about 21,000 birds as of right now. Their conservation status is vulnerable, but it is not considered endangered. Anybody have any questions so far?
I just wanted to make one comment with the first picture you had of the Alaikeokeo. The red on its forehead there is kind of an anomaly with the species in Hawaii, and no researcher has really figured out why some of the Alaikeokeo have the red forehead and some don't. So that's not a telltale feature. If you are new to birding and going out and looking for this species, you're not always going to see that red there. And we've asked Lindsay Neatman, who's presented with us before, she's DOFA's Division of Forestry and Wildlife's wildlife biologist. I've asked her about that as well, and she did not know. She just said it's an anomaly. It happens on some birds and not on others. So it's one of those really cool things that would be awesome to research.
Yeah, I agree. That is definitely something. It is also more of a royal red, I could say, instead of like the bright red that you'd see on the Lai'ula. So that's really cool too. All right, moving on to a couple of videos of the Hawaiian coot. Okay, so this is it basically nesting. I'm gonna skip a little bit.
Did she go over really?
Similar to the Lai'ula, it forages throughout these types of vegetation and just kind of filters out what it can find. Got its little baby. Similar to the Lai'ula nest. All right, and then here's a video of the Hawaiian coot and the Hawaiian moorhen battling for territory, which is a really cool video to come across. And so, like I said, when they are territorial, they definitely, will put up a fight if they need to. It's really cool to point out that wing display that the Alaikeokeos will put on to kind of make themselves look bigger. But yeah, that was a really cool video because when I watched it, I was like, wow, that was brutal. I didn't expect, these two birds to kind of go at it almost like, they were willing to drown each other at some point because it was that serious. So let me know if you guys have any questions or comments about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting at the end of that video. I don't know if you guys saw the other coot run in from the top, but they don't really fly either, and they'll just kind of like flap their wings and just like run across the water for 100 yards instead of flying. It's very interesting to watch them and hear them coming, like the pitter patter of the slapping of the feet. You'll hear them running before you see them. So yeah, they're just a funny bird to watch. And then the babies in the video, they have this I don't know if you guys can see it. It's actually a good, kind of good shot right there. It almost looks like a golden little puff lay. So they're, as babies, yeah, that's very easy to distinguish between the alaula and the coot when they're babies, and they'll lose that little lay golden puff in about a week, and then they'll start turning like a little gray fluff ball. So then yeah, they're very distinguishable, but that's a really kind of unique little feature for a week or so on those birds.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think that's a really good point. And every now and then, you know, when we see them kind of chasing each other throughout the mud flats, it's really funny to kind of see them like essentially walk on water or try to. But yeah, they do the little pitter patter, and they can go pretty quick. All right, moving on. So we have our Koala maoli, or our Hawaiian duck, up next. The diet is fairly opportunistic. They like to feast on snails, dragonfly larvae, grass seeds, worms, and other wetland plants. Its behavior is usually found alone or in pairs. Wary birds, especially when nesting or molting, although during winter, they may gather in large numbers to exploit a lot of food resources. And throughout our estuary, Heia estuary, we do see them, you know, in pairs, and they sometimes do kind of, you know, get into little commotions with each other. If any, you know, if one group comes across another group, they kind of go up, and they'll start talking back and forth. Its habitat is a variety of freshwater habitats, again, wetlands primarily. Its movements between feeding and breeding habitats occur a lot, and also movement between Kaua'i and Niihau is known to occur. So this species typically forages in the shallow waters. There's few nests that are found in areas that are frequented by humans, and also, you know, I feel like they also know where not to put their nests, as opposed to where like the mammalian predators that may have occurred in the same area as them could still be present. That's why I see them laying a lot throughout our mud flats, is because we don't have much of a predator influx as far as we know. Generally, they lay about 8 to 10 eggs, and they will hatch after an unknown incubation period, which is a really cool fact, but likely less than about 30 days. So their species nesting biology in general is poorly known. Their conservation status is known as endangered. And also, going back to its abundance, it is closely related to a well-known but non-native mallard. And it is essentially it's a hybrid of the non-native mallard. So what you would see in the non-native mallard in the male is more of a greener complexion throughout the head, and a lot more of a color display throughout the body as well. But then in the Koala maoli, you will kind of see it resembles the female a lot, almost identical. So it is a really cool thing to kind of point out when you guys are looking at the ducks. Maybe you can take a peek at the royal blue that he's got going down underneath here, and that can kind of give away, you know, whether it's a male or a female.
I think this is a good spot to kind of just say that for Oahu in particular, there are very few pure Koala ducks on Oahu, and of course, always more research into these species is important. They are able to interbreed with the mallards, so finding a pure Koala on Oahu is pretty difficult. And then also IDing them just by looking at them can also be very hard, because they are so similar to the female mallards. But we do know of a few pairs of Koala that have had fledglings in the past, and the places that I have seen them are usually upper reaches of stream systems around taro patches. So a little bit more remote, secretive ducks. Any that we'd be seeing in the Kailua area, if they were to pair up, likely would be a hybrid between the Koloa and the mallard. Of course, Kaua'i and Ni'ihau do have more established populations of the pure Koloa.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wish I could have actually found like an actual statistic about how good our populations are doing as of right now. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, they are still considered endangered. All right, so moving on to the Koloa duck range map and nesting facts in Hawaii. The Koloa mo'oli is found on the 5 major islands, except for Koho'olawe. It is not found on Koho'olawe. And I believe the reason why that has been is because due to studies haven't been updated in a really long time, I believe that, you know, there could still be a chance that there is a population in Koho'olawe. And pairs may nest in lowland habitats. On Kaua'i, they like to nest near upper Alaka'i swamp, which is in a really high elevation, plus 3,000 feet. Their nesting occurs year round, but mostly between January and May. Nesting is usually on the ground or near water, but few nests are found in areas frequented by humans. So they lay around 8 to 10 eggs, and they hatch for an unknown incubation period. Like I said, the species nesting biology is poorly unknown. Okay, so a look at behavioral patterns, kind of like an example of what I was saying earlier. Here's a good description of the Alai'ula and the Alaike'oke'o. So they are kind of battling amongst close territories, and it's always kind of a 2 against 1 type of deal, as you can see. So the Hawaiian coot is kind of like, hey, you know, like, what did I do? And the Hawaiian moorhen is kind of like really using those feet as a way to kind of, you know, push them out of the area. So the feet are also like a defensive tool that they got going on. Over here on the right, though, you do see the Koloa duck resting, and then also the Io as it's searching through the mudflats looking for prey. So throughout our He'ia estuary, you do see these birds all within the vicinity of each other. You know, sometimes you'll see them get too close and they get a little antsy about it. But like for the most part, the Koloa duck and the Io stilt fairly do well with each other. And I do know if the Koloa duck does get kind of close to the Alai'ula nest, the Alai'ula will also kind of chase them away. Any questions? Okay. So these are our transient and migratory birds that have recently visited Koalapoca region. And I just wanted to briefly go over this because we just had recently had some visitors at our He'ia estuary site. That was a really cool, you know, way to kind of look at them in person and see how their character is, what they like to do. So the first off visitor that we had last fall, I believe, or I mean, let me just say a little bit more towards wintertime, we had the hooded merganzer show up to our He'ia estuary. And the species is widespread across North America, but it migrates in small flocks to Hawaii. And it is known to have done this for quite some time. There's records going back to about 1915 to even have Hawaiian moorhens, or sorry, hooded merganzers here in Hawaii. So they're found in calm areas of water such as wetland and estuarine habitats, and never really found sitting on the ocean. And they like to nest in small ponds or marshes. This is a really cool photo of the hooded merganzer, just so you guys can see the difference between the male and the female. And the male has got some really amazing colors to display, and it's really cool to see. And also, I believe, you know, the juvenile will also have this brownish look to it, because when we had our visitor at our He'ia wetland site, it essentially was either a female or a juvenile. It was brown. We really couldn't make of it. Not much white coming in, but it was really cool to see. It was a really nice time. But yeah, we also have our spotted sandpiper that had visited us in the He'ia estuary mudflats. And here's a good picture of what the adult would look like and what the juvenile looks like. So they do come here seasonally. They breed in northern Alaska in the summer and in southern America and Pacific coasts in the wintertime. So they like to eat insects, crustaceans, and vertebrates. They kind of do have the same character as the Io and same foraging habitat. And they're most widespread. They are the most widespread breeding sandpiper species in North America. So we do see a lot of them throughout our beaches. They aren't too shy when it comes to people. They are, you know, they're well known about it. But I like this photo because it does show the black and whites, the black spots underneath its white underbelly in the adult. And when they come here to our mudflats in Hawaii, they don't have the spots, the black spots quite yet. And as they start to progress throughout the season and grow older, you'll start to see right before they leave Hawaii, they've got the black spots, they're starting to get their nice colors in, and then they're off back up to the Alaskan continent. Anybody have any questions?
I'll just comment really quickly. The Merganzer was a really neat find at the Hei'ia project, and it sent the birding world in Hawaii into a little frenzy. We had quite a few telephoto lenses visiting the project site. And it was just one of those things that, you know, we look out on the project as we're walking through in the morning and like, ducks, hey ducks, and you're like, wait a minute, that like mohawk off the back is so striking, and it really is a smaller statured bird. And in North America, it's a diving species, so its legs are set farther back on its body. So when it walks across the mudflats, it is very awkward looking. And it was a single bird at our Hei'ia project, and it stayed with us for about 2 months. And I believe that there were only about 5 or 6 other merganzers in the state over the winter. Some were on Maui and some were on the Big Island. So this was likely one of a small flock that had gotten blown off course, and it stayed with us for a little while and then it was gone again. And the sandpiper was also very unique, and I would not have known it from the akekeke, our other rooty turnstones that visit, if it hadn't been for the birders that were out watching the merganser telling us that we had a spotted sandpiper. And I was lucky enough to see it on the project site just once. It flew in, and it's very different from the akekeke. It's kind of the same stature and coloration, but when it lands, its little tail feathers just continue to bounce. So it can be standing and walking and looking for food, but its little tail feathers just keep moving. And so that was, for me, one of the only distinguishing features that I was like, oh, okay, our local birds don't really do that. So it was definitely some cool finds this summer and finds this winter. And last winter, we had bristle-thighed curlew visit the project site for 1 day as well. And they're a pretty cool species. We'll let Michael chime in a few minutes about their project, but I know that James Campbell does tend to get a lot of the bristle-thighed curlews. Okay, Maya.
Awesome. Any more questions? Feel free to stop if you guys do. All right, so onto our habitat restoration efforts. So currently there is a lot going on in the Koalapoca region when it comes to restoration efforts. It's a very good sign. We're on a good path. However, there is more that we can do. So the goals of specific conservation actions are not only to protect current populations of native wetland birds and their key breeding habitats, but also to establish additional populations, thereby reducing the risk of extinction. So the state of Hawaii and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services has protected over 23% of the state's remaining coastal plain wetlands. It's a very good start. In 1997, Ducks Unlimited developed a comprehensive and cooperative plan, and this essentially was to protect and restore the wetlands used by native water birds in the Koalapoca region. So continue restoration and also continue of protection of the management and wildlife sanctuaries and refuges is really important. So the restoration of wetland habitat as well as continued management of an existing habitat is also very key. And, you know, in order to do that, we have to go in and focus on remediation efforts, taking out invasive grasses, taking out invasive animals, anything that we can do to make sure that their habitat is not depleted. So we do want to improve life history research and population monitoring for these top 5 wetland bird species. And a lot of basic life history research needs to be updated. So we are going to go ahead and continue waterbird surveys and habitat monitoring on all of the islands. And this information is kind of needed to identify the significant population declines, especially when it comes to anything that's going on with our alai'ula or Hawaiian moorhen. And we do want to conduct education and awareness programs. So they're particularly to address issues of predation by rats, dogs, mongoose, feral cats, and we also want to continue statewide surveys of populations in known and likely habitats. So one thing we do want to go further into is monitoring the population responses of invasive species. And this is very important when it comes to our feral mongoose population and as well as feral cat population. These are the top two factors that kind of affect our native birds and whether they make it to adulthood or not. And by taking more surveys on the invasive species population is only gonna give us a better idea of what we're exactly working with, how many mongooses we actually do have in the Koalapoca region. So we want to design studies to facilitate comparisons between populations of native wetland birds in the urban areas and also those located in more rural locations, kind of pair them side by side, see what's going on, and see if we see any trends. So a really good example would be like kind of comparing the trend between Kailua and Hamakua Marsh area compared to maybe like Hei'ia wetland estuary area where it's not as urbanized. So a little bit more on the habitat restoration efforts and common statewide and island conservation actions. In particular, the alai'ula is going to be undergoing some reintroduction efforts in Molokai and Maui. The IO will be more concerned about the effective predator control methods. And that being said, when we went over what their nests look like, I think that's why this is kind of a key factor to improving their population is predator control, because their nests are so prone to being attacked or yeah. But the Koala duck, we want to focus on importation restrictions on mallards to kind of like to bring down that population. We're not too sure what we want to do with the hybrid population. I do see some reports that people are thinking about taking them out completely. Some people are like, well, you know, the hybrids are so intermixed at this point, it wouldn't really make a difference. But I definitely agree that, you know, controlling the mallard population would definitely help with our Koloa maoli. And the Alaikeokeo, we want to conduct more long-term demographic studies because we do like to pair a lot of the survey records from alai'ula. We like to kind of pair it up with the Alaikeokeo, being that they're kind of so similar. But you know, a lot of the reproductive biology and feeding habitats of Alaikeokeo is kind of referenced from alai'ula. So it's kind of like, well, you know, this is kind of what it is. This is kind of what Alaikeokeo could be. So demographic studies are definitely needed. And the Alku'u, there's currently no conservation actions. It's a poorly known species. So we definitely do want to conduct more studies and especially look at their predation on young native birds and how that kind of affects native wetland reserves, such as like Koinoa Marsh, where you see Alku'u all over the place, you know? And so DLNR and DOFA, which is Department of Land and Natural Resources and Department of Forestry and Wildlife, in total has 60 acres of restored wetland habitat for the endangered alai'ula, Io, Alaikeokeo, and the Koloa duck. Another 20 acres will be used to reforest upland portions of the marsh for native trees, community restoration, community recreation areas, and educational opportunities for the neighboring communities. So I really liked this plan because it will kind of bring in our grade school kids to kind of, you know, have a better understanding of what our wetland habitats do for Koalapoca region. And, you know, once you kind of start them young, get them into it, they kind of really do spark more of an interest of like, okay, you know, our native wetland bird population is a very important factor when it comes to our watershed health. And so lastly, a really good point is that, you know, reviving abandoned lo'i fields is really a key factor when it comes to aquaculture demand. So it would be beneficial for people such that, you know, they're growing things such as taro, and they can also grow other things that could be eaten, and also would be beneficial to the native birds because they use them as forage, but they don't deplete the sources of the taro. And so with that being said, I'm going to wrap everything up and leave anybody with any comments, questions, anything you guys want to go over. I can always go back to any slides. If you guys want to look at anything, just let me know. But yeah, thank you so much for your time today.
Awesome. Thanks, Maya. We have some time. I know we've gone over a little bit, but that's awesome. Great conversations and awesome videos of the birds doing things we haven't seen before. Does anybody have questions? Feel free to come off of mute, and then I also will give Michael a little bit of time to talk about his work at Campbell and maybe hopefully some possibilities for the public to access that refuge again in the future. Any questions? Maya, can you just maybe go back to your opening slide for us, and we'll just pause it on that. Well, okay, I'm not really seeing any questions. Michael, do you want to just talk a little bit about the refuge that's up in Koalapoca area?
Yeah, thank you very much. Maya, that was a very well put together presentation. It's very thorough. Yeah, just amazing. Thank you very much for doing that. So I work with the Fish and Wildlife, and we take care of three main ponds on the island. There's the main one, which is basically refurbished sugarcane watering fields that have been turned into bird habitat, so we have all these species and more that Maya went over, and the other two are on the Pearl Harbor property. One is in Waiava, the other is in Honouliuli, which is in Ewa, and that one actually has it's off of a bike path, walking path, and you can actually view all of the birds that we went over today from that platform. Just bring a great pair of binoculars, but I'll tell you that there's one pond, you know, 10 feet from the platform, which has active broods of all of these birds. So you can sit there. I would recommend taking your time and really, you got to look for them. They're very cryptic, especially the stilts babies. I didn't think they existed for a long time, but you just got to watch for them. They're little puff balls. But yeah, so I would recommend everybody checking that out. You know, watching these birds is a very important part of understanding them. And that is what I've been lucky enough to do in my KUPU term this year. We currently do reproductive surveys 3 days a week at all three of these sites, basically driving around the pond and counting nests and watching for babies and seeing the same babies and watching them fledge. And so that's some of that data that Maya was talking about the last section, and very important stuff. You know, I've learned a ton. I hope that all the data is, you know, helping move forward with, you know, helping with this. You know, Koalapoca has turned the Hei'eia site into such a great habitat. I know it's only a matter of time before, and that's another great place to go check out some of these birds, because they are coming back, and all the hard work has paid off. And so yeah, again, Maya, you did a great job. I think that I learned a lot, you know, and I thought I knew a lot, and I do now more than I thought I did. So I don't have much to add on other than yeah, good job.
I have one question for Michael, actually, because I've got to visit the James Campbell Wildlife Refuge once, and I was just so amazed by the variety of birds that were there during the winter. There were seagulls, there were just really random things for Hawaii. I know you've been only working there for a short time, maybe 6 months now. Is there a particular species that is like the oddity that has stuck out to you that's come through the refuge, or are you not really seeing anything because of the time of year right now?
No, when I first started, a lot of the birds were in heavy migratory status, and we had a couple oddballs for the refuge in general. And at the time, I can't remember off the top of my head, but for me personally, you talked about the bristle-thighed curlew. You could have sworn it was a native bird. The way that they you know, filled in the ponds there for about, you know, a month, and then kind of just disappeared. There's actually maybe a half dozen left on the refuge, and you know, as far as I understand, they're either too young or they just missed their window, and they're just going to have to tough it out here, which I'm not sure why they go back, because it is it's great habitat there for them, which I'm glad they don't, because you know, more room for the birds that we like and need here in Hawaii. So other than that, I thought I saw there's some geese, a cackling goose that looked was pretty cool. He hung out with some he just was kind of a loner, but some of the birds kind of hung out with him, and I think felt bad for him for a while. So that was kind of interesting, but yeah. And as far as opportunities as the refuge, as far as the pandemic and things opening up, I know I personally, as a KUPU, am trying to put together a group of sorts to do some work up there, which would, you know, entail going across some of the property, in which case it'd be a 2-in-1 seeing some of these birds. So I will keep in contact with Nalani and Maya, and see if she can't put out something, and I'll definitely try to put out something myself on any future visitation stuff, and keep you updated on their policies as far as their tourism stuff and what they're going to do.
Wonderful. Yeah, I know that Audubon Society is another great organization to follow if you're interested in birding tours, etc. I think they are starting to open up some of their activities as well, and that was how I was able to visit the refuge in the past, was through a tour organized with the Hawaii Audubon Society. So another great organization to follow along with their work, and they have restoration sites for a lot of the seabirds as well. So thank you, Maya, so much for your presentation today, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Any last questions really quickly?
I just have one question. It doesn't have to do with the, well, in a way it has to do with the birds. I walk the dike path every week. I didn't walk it this week, but a friend of mine said, you know, like on the marsh side, where there's like sometimes open pieces of water, okay, and I had noticed that a lot of them had been cleared out of the water lettuce and stuff. But this week, wait, what day is this? Okay, yeah, this past Thursday, a couple friends walked, and in one of those patches where like the water lettuce was growing, there was like, she showed me a picture of kind of like a reddish rust colored cover over the, what is that?
That's a different type of aquatic plant, and it's not if you go down to look at it, it's really tiny little leaves, and it's used a lot of times in taro patches as a water cover to keep the temperature of the water colder, create better habitat for the taro to grow. So it's probably a species in the heavy rains recently that's washed downstream from some of the taro patches that are either up in Manoa or at Ulupo. But it is another type of aquatic plant species. I don't think right now that it's a species of concern because it doesn't get any larger than that. It can definitely fill up a waterway, but it's not going to really inhibit the bird's movement through the water.
Okay, because that piece of water, the part of water that it was in was like totally covered by it. And on the far edge, there was a few water lettuce, but it was like totally covered. So I didn't know if it was like an algae bloom or something, because it was like you couldn't see the water. And okay.
Yeah,
so
I think
it's okay stuff.
It's not a
Half and half.
huge problem. It's not going to get as big as the water lettuce. It's not really going to get any. I'm fairly certain I know exactly which part you are talking about. Our staff was out working on Kauai Nui on the levee yesterday, and we were talking about that patch. It could definitely expand throughout the waterway, but it's not going to become a bigger species. So, we're actively removing the water lettuce and the water hyacinth and trying to control some of the other cattails, umbrella sedge, those types of things. But that's not a big species of concern for DOFA at the moment. So we may go through something simple like a pool net or a fishing net could clean up quite a bit of it quickly. So we might try to tackle it at some point in the near future.
So is it just part of what comes up in the lo'i naturally?
Yeah, it's not a native species, but it's something that's been used pretty widespread by kalo farmers as just a way to keep the water cooler and shaded from the sun.
Okay, interesting. Mahalo.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us on our second Saturday education series. Stay tuned to our newsletter for announcements on next month and our future. These are going to be running at least through mid-fall. And I've really enjoyed hosting these. I believe next month we will have a guest speaker from the Oahu Invasive Species Committee on to talk about their work in the Koalapoca region with different invasive species that are found in the area. Everything from little fire ants to recent koki frog populations found in Waimanalo. That's a scary one to me. And also different invasive plant species that they are still able to hopefully eradicate from the area. So we'll be hearing from OISC next month, and we'll have some announcements on future presentations for you then. And as always, I've put the link for our YouTube channel. You can find our past recordings, and this recording will be posted to the YouTube channel within the next week. So thank you guys so much for joining my awesome presentation. Loved learning. Thank you, everyone. Aloha.